You just gave a homeless woman your unlimited credit card. Are you insane? The text from Caleb Monroe's CFO lit up his phone screen at 6:47 a.m., but the billionaire CEO didn't flinch. Standing in his penthouse office overlooking Boston Harbor, he watched the transaction notifications roll in, each one a small detonation against everything he'd built his empire believing. Somewhere in the city below, Lena Parker, a woman he'd met exactly 1 hour ago in a frozen subway station, was making choices that would either validate his darkest assumptions about human nature or shatter them completely. The first charge appeared, $47.23 at a drugstore. Then another, and another. Each purchase was a referendum on whether poverty bred desperation or dignity, whether his years of cutthroat business had taught him truth or lies about survival. By noon, one of them would be proven right. By evening, one of them would be transformed forever. Before we continue, I invite you to follow this story to its powerful conclusion. Please like this video and comment with the city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel and connecting with viewers around the world. The Boston dawn came cold and merciless, the kind of February morning that turned breath to vapor and made metal burn against skin. Caleb Monroe emerged from the Charles Street station at 5:43 a.m., his $1,000 overcoat doing little against the wind that knifed through the financial district. He'd taken the subway, actually taken public transportation, for the first time in 8 years, and the experience had been exactly as he remembered: cramped, inefficient, filled with the resigned faces of people who had no choice but to endure it. He'd made the journey as a test, a personal experiment in humility that his therapist had suggested after his third divorce and his daughter's refusal to attend Christmas dinner. "You've lost touch with how most people live," Dr. Patricia Vance had said in their last session, her voice maddeningly calm. "You see the world from 30 floors up, Caleb. When was the last time you stood in it?" So here he was, standing in it, and hating every frozen second. The station entrance behind him exhaled warmth and the smell of unwashed humanity. Caleb was about to hail a car when he noticed her, a woman huddled against the brick wall of the station building, a child sleeping against her shoulder. Both were wrapped in layers that looked insufficient even from a distance. The woman's eyes were closed, but her body remained tense, protective, one arm locked around the girl even in exhausted half-sleep. Caleb had seen hundreds like her, thousands probably, though he'd trained himself not to see them at all. They were part of the urban landscape, like scaffolding or construction barriers, temporary obstacles to navigate around. His standard operating procedure was to keep walking, to let the city's vast network of social services handle problems that weren't his responsibility. But Dr. Vance's voice echoed in his skull. "When was the last time you stood in it?" Before his rational mind could intervene, Caleb's feet carried him across the sidewalk. Up close, the woman looked younger than he'd expected, mid-20s maybe, though exhaustion and cold had drawn harsh lines around her eyes. The child couldn't have been older than 6 or 7. Both wore donated winter coats that were 2 sizes too large, and the woman's boots had duct tape wrapped around the sole where it had separated from the upper. "Excuse me," Caleb said. The woman's eyes snapped open, and in that instant he saw the full cocktail of emotions that homelessness produced: fear, shame, defiance, resignation. She pulled her daughter closer, and the child stirred but didn't wake. "I don't want trouble," the woman said quietly. "We're leaving in a minute. Just waiting for it to warm up a little." "I'm not—" Caleb stopped, realizing he had no idea how to finish that sentence. What was he? Not a cop. Not a social worker. Not someone who did this sort of thing. "I'm not here to move you along." The woman studied him with sharp, intelligent eyes that took in his designer coat, his leather briefcase, the Patek Philippe watch just visible beneath his cuff. Her expression hardened slightly, the look of someone who'd learned not to trust people who had too much. "What do you want, then?" It was a fair question. What did he want? To feel better about himself? To prove something to his therapist? To his daughter? To demonstrate that despite building a private equity empire by identifying weakness and exploiting it, he was still capable of basic human decency? "How long have you been out here?" he asked instead. "That's not really your business." "You're right. I apologize." Caleb shifted his weight, suddenly aware of how ridiculous this entire interaction was. A billionaire making small talk with a homeless woman at dawn, while his driver waited 4 blocks away and his morning briefing started in 20 minutes. Is there something I can do? Can I buy you breakfast? Get you into a shelter? Shelters are full, the woman said flatly. Have been since January, and I appreciate the offer, but I've learned that free breakfast usually comes with a sermon or a lecture or someone trying to fix my life without asking what I actually need. The bluntness caught him off guard. He was used to deference, to the careful politeness that people used around someone who controlled hundreds of millions in capital. This woman spoke to him like he was just another person, which, he supposed, was exactly what Dr. Vance had been trying to get him to experience. Fair enough, Caleb said. So what do you actually need? About 15,000 things I can't have. The woman adjusted her grip on her sleeping daughter. But right now, I need it to be 7 a.m. so the library opens and we can get warm. I need my daughter to sleep another hour so she doesn't ask for breakfast I can't afford. I need my phone to stay charged so I don't miss a call from the 3 jobs I applied to yesterday. She stopped herself, jaw tightening. I need to stop talking to strangers who can't help anyway. Caleb should have walked away. Should have offered a $20 bill and congratulated himself on his charitable gesture. Should have climbed into his waiting car and returned to his world of quarterly reports and hostile takeovers. Instead, he reached into his wallet and pulled out a credit card. Not just any credit card. His personal American Express Centurion card, the black card that came with no preset spending limit, that opened doors at private banks and exclusive lounges, that marked its holder as someone who lived in an entirely different economic universe. Take this, he said, holding it out. The woman stared at the card like he'd just offered her a live grenade. What? Take it. Use it for whatever you need today. Food, clothes, phone charger, hotel room if you want, whatever. What? The woman didn't reach for the card. Is this a joke? Some kind of social media stunt? No stunt, no cameras, just a card. You're insane. You don't know me. I could drain your account. You could try, Caleb said. There's no limit. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. The woman's face cycled through disbelief, suspicion, and something that might have been anger. Why? She finally asked. It was the question Caleb had been asking himself. Why break every rule of financial sense and personal security? Why hand unlimited purchasing power to a complete stranger? Why conduct an experiment that could only end in either confirming his worst assumptions about human nature or forcing him to confront them? Because I want to see what you do with it, he said honestly. I've spent my entire career believing certain things about people, about what they want, about what they'll do when they have access to resources. I want to know if I'm right. So I'm your psychology experiment. We're both the experiment, Caleb corrected. He stepped forward and placed the card on the ground between them, close enough for her to reach but not forcing contact. My name is Caleb Monroe. That card will work anywhere, anytime. Use it however you see fit. I'll be back here at 6 p.m. If you're here, you can return it then. If you're not, he shrugged, then I'll know something different about the world than I knew this morning. He turned and walked away before she could respond, before his rational mind could reassert control, before he could calculate all the ways this could backfire. Behind him, he heard the woman's voice, sharp with confusion and something else. Wait, I don't know if I can... But Caleb kept walking. The test had begun. Booked. By the time Caleb reached his office on the 30th floor of the Millennium Tower, 3 things had happened. First, his head of security had called 4 times, each voicemail progressively more frantic about the unauthorized card access that had triggered their fraud alert systems. Second, his CFO had sent the text that was still glowing on his phone screen. You just gave a homeless woman your unlimited credit card. Are you insane? And third, the first charge had appeared. Caleb stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, phone in hand, watching the notification materialize. Transaction alert, $47.23. CVS Pharmacy, 127 Charles Street, 4723. The amount was so specific, so modest. Not $500 at a high-end restaurant. Not $2,000 at a luxury boutique. $47.23 at a drugstore. His phone buzzed again. Marcus Chen, his CFO, was calling for the sixth time. "I know what you're going to say," Caleb answered. "Do you?" Marcus's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "Because I'm looking at our security dashboard right now, and it's showing that your personal black card, the card with literally unlimited credit, is actively being used by someone who is definitely not you. Please tell me you reported it stolen." "I didn't report it stolen because it wasn't stolen. I gave it to someone." A pause. Then, "Gave it? You gave your unlimited credit card to someone. That's correct?" "Who?" "A woman I met this morning." "Jesus Christ, Caleb. Please tell me this is some kind of, I don't know, romantic gesture? A new girlfriend? Someone you actually know?" "I met her approximately 90 minutes ago. She was homeless. She has a daughter." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Caleb checked to see if the call had dropped. "Marcus?" "I'm trying to decide," Marcus said slowly, "whether you've had a mental breakdown or if you're testing me somehow." "This is a test, right? You're seeing if I'll overreact?" "It's not a test. Well, it is a test, but not of you." "Then of what?" Caleb watched another notification appear, $31.50. Dunkin' Donuts, 94 Cambridge Street. "Human nature," he said quietly. "That's..." Marcus made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a groan. "That's the most expensive social experiment in history. Do you understand what you've done? That card could be used to buy a car. Multiple cars. A house. She could wire herself $1 million. I know. And you're just watching, monitoring the transactions." "Yes." "For how long?" "Until 6 p.m. Then I'm meeting her at the same location." "What if she doesn't show up?" "Then I'll have learned something valuable about risk and trust." Marcus made another sound of exasperation. "Caleb, I've been your CFO for 9 years. I've watched you negotiate with sovereign wealth funds. I've seen you walk away from billion-dollar deals because the terms weren't perfect. You've never made a decision this reckless." "Maybe that's the problem," Caleb said softly. He ended the call before Marcus could respond and watched the city below. Somewhere in that grid of streets and buildings, Lena Parker, he'd seen the name on the card transaction, was making choices. Small ones so far. Careful ones. But the day was young, and the real test hadn't yet begun. At 8:15 a.m., Caleb sat through his executive team meeting without hearing a word. His phone rested on the conference table in front of him, and every few minutes it would vibrate with a new notification. His senior staff pretended not to notice, but their sidelong glances grew more frequent as the morning wore on. Transaction alert, 8947. Target, 180, Somerville Avenue. Transaction alert, 1299. CVS Pharmacy, 127 Charles Street. Transaction alert, 156. Boston Children's Hospital. Walk-in clinic. That last one made him sit forward. A medical clinic. For the daughter, probably. $156,000 wasn't an emergency room, just a walk-in appointment. Something necessary but not urgent. Something a parent without insurance would have to save for weeks to afford. "Caleb?" His VP of Operations, Jennifer Wu, was staring at him with concern. "Did you hear the question?" "I'm sorry, what?" "The Manchester acquisition. The board wants your decision by Friday." Manchester Holdings. A struggling regional investment firm that Caleb could acquire for pennies on the dollar, strip for assets, and flip within a quarter. $12 million in profit, 300 jobs eliminated. Standard procedure. "Tell them I need more time," he said. Jennifer's eyebrows rose. Caleb Monroe never needed more time. He was famous for his decisive brutality, for knowing exactly what something was worth and what it would cost to extract that value. "How much time?" "I'll let you know." Another notification. $43.15. Star Market, 45 Bowdoin Street. Groceries. She was buying groceries. The amount suggested careful shopping, not impulsive grabbing. Someone who knew how to stretch a dollar because every dollar had always mattered. The meeting continued around him, but Caleb's attention remained fixed on his phone. Each transaction was a data point, a piece of information about who Lena Parker was and what she valued. The pattern emerging wasn't what he'd expected. No luxury items, no expensive meals, no cash advances. Just the grinding necessities of survival purchased with careful precision. At 10:30 a.m., his executive assistant knocked on his open office door. "Mr. Monroe, your 11 o'clock is here." Caleb glanced at his calendar. Richard Thornton, his attorney, scheduled for a meeting about the divorce settlement with wife number 3. Another piece of wreckage from a life built on the assumption that success meant never being vulnerable, never trusting, never giving without calculating the return. "Reschedule it," Caleb said. "For when?" "I don't know. Next week." His assistant hesitated. Richard said it was urgent, something about asset disclosure deadlines. "Tell him I'm conducting an experiment in human nature, and I'll call him when it's complete." The assistant's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing complete bewilderment. Then she recovered, nodded, and retreated. Caleb returned to his window. Another notification. Transaction alert, $67. Children's Place, 180 Somerville Avenue. Children's clothes. Winter clothes probably, given the price point and season. Not designer brands, not even mid-range. Just warm things for a child who needed them. His phone rang. Not Marcus this time. Emily. His daughter. The one who'd refused to come to Christmas. The one who'd told him 6 months ago that having money didn't make him rich. It just made him expensive. "Em," he answered. "Dad? Marcus just called me. He said you've had some kind of breakdown." "I haven't had a breakdown." "He said you gave your credit card to a homeless woman." "That's accurate, yes." "Why?" It was the same question everyone kept asking. Why? Why would someone who'd built an empire on calculated risk take the most incalculable risk imaginable? Why would someone who trusted no one place infinite trust in a stranger? "Because," Caleb said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "I've spent the last 43 years of my life believing that people are fundamentally selfish. That given unlimited resources, they'll take everything they can. That poverty doesn't build character, it reveals the lack of it, and I want to know if I'm right." That's... Emily stopped. "That's either the most arrogant thing you've ever said or the first honest question you've asked in years." "Maybe both." "What happens if she maxes out the card? If she buys herself a car and checks into the Four Seasons? Then I'll know I was right all along. And if she doesn't?" Caleb watched the Charles River wind through the city below, its surface catching the late morning light. "Then I'll know I've been wrong about everything." Emily was quiet for a long moment. "I hope you're wrong, Dad. I really do." She hung up, and Caleb realized he hoped the same thing. By noon, Lena Parker had made 11 transactions totaling $623.43. Not a single one was frivolous. Caleb had assigned his junior analyst, a bright, skeptical woman named Sarah Park, to categorize each purchase. "They're all necessities," Sarah reported, standing in his doorway with a tablet. Children's medicine, winter clothes for the kid, basic groceries, a phone charger, and a month of phone service. Oh, and she paid an outstanding medical bill at the clinic. Looks like it was from a previous visit that went to collections. "Nothing for herself?" Caleb asked. "One thing. A $23 meal at Panera. She and the kid shared it. There's only one sandwich on the receipt, but 2 drinks." Caleb turned from the window. "Show me all the receipts." Sarah pulled up the detailed transaction log on her tablet and handed it to him. Caleb scrolled through slowly, reading each line item. The CVS purchase, children's acetaminophen, cough syrup, bandages, a toothbrush, and toothpaste. The Target run, a winter coat, snow boots, thermal underwear, socks, all children's sizes. The grocery store, pasta, rice, canned vegetables, milk, bread, peanut butter. Nothing organic, nothing name brand. Just calories and nutrition purchased with ruthless efficiency. "What kind of person does this?" Sarah asked quietly. "I don't know," Caleb admitted. "That's why I'm watching." At 1:47 p.m., a different kind of notification appeared. Transaction alert, $125,000. Women's Lunch Place, 67 Newberry Street. Caleb pulled up the organization on his computer. A donation. Lena Parker, with access to unlimited funds, had made a donation to a women's shelter. Not a large one. $125 wouldn't transform any organization, but enough to matter, enough to help. Jesus, Sarah breathed, reading over his shoulder. She's giving it away? Caleb couldn't speak. He stared at the transaction record, his mind struggling to process what it meant. A woman with nothing had been given everything, and her instinct, her choice, had been to help others who had even less. Mr. Monroe? Sarah's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you okay? No, Caleb thought. He wasn't okay. Because in that $125 donation, he saw the collapse of every assumption he'd built his life upon. He saw the poverty of his own imagination, his inability to conceive that character might exist independent of circumstance. He saw 43 years of cynicism revealed as nothing more than a comfortable lie he told himself to justify the ruthlessness required to succeed. Pull up everything we know about her, Caleb said hoarsely. I want to see who she is. Sarah hesitated. That feels like an invasion of privacy. She has my credit card, my unlimited credit card. I think I'm entitled to know who I'm trusting. Are you, though? Sarah asked quietly. Entitled? If you're really testing human nature, shouldn't you let her actions speak for themselves? Caleb looked at his analyst with new respect. You're right, no background check. We watched the transactions and nothing else. The afternoon crawled forward. More purchases appeared. $45 at a laundromat, $28 at a Dollar Tree for school supplies, $89 for a used tablet from a pawn shop that would presumably allow the daughter to do homework. At 3:15 p.m., Lena bought a $200 prepaid debit card. Caleb tensed at that one, wondering if she was preparing to liquidate funds, but then watched as she immediately used it to pay down what appeared to be a payday loan debt. She was cleaning up her financial life. Not indulging in it, not escaping from it, organizing it, making order from chaos. At 4 p.m., Marcus appeared in Caleb's office without knocking. We have a problem, he said. What kind of problem? The kind where financial media is starting to pick up on unusual activity on your accounts. Bloomberg just called asking if Monroe Holdings was making any major acquisitions we hadn't disclosed. They're seeing the transaction volume and assuming it's corporate activity. Tell them it's personal. That's worse. Then they'll assume you're liquidating assets. The stock will tank. Caleb turned back to his window. His stock price. His corporate reputation. His carefully constructed image as the man who never made emotional decisions. All of it suddenly seemed laughably small compared to what was happening somewhere in the streets below. Let it tank, he said. Caleb, I'm serious, Marcus. If the market can't handle one day of unusual activity, then maybe our valuation was artificial to begin with. Marcus stared at him like he'd started speaking in tongues. Who are you, and what have you done with my CEO? I'm figuring that out, Caleb said softly. At 5:30 p.m., with the Boston sky dimming toward evening, Caleb left his office. He told his executive team he wouldn't be reachable for the rest of the day. He ignored 3 calls from board members and a carefully worded email from his general counsel about fiduciary responsibility. He took the elevator down 30 floors and walked out into the February cold without calling his driver. He was going to take the subway again. The Charles Street station looked different in the late afternoon. Commuters packed the platform, tired workers heading home, students with headphones, tourists consulting phone maps. Caleb rode the red line for 3 stops, then transferred to green, letting the rhythm of public transportation remind him that most of life happened in these in-between spaces, these utilitarian moments he'd spent decades avoiding. When he emerged back at Charles Street, the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. Full dark was an hour away, but the streetlights were already buzzing to life. The spot where he'd encountered Lena that morning was empty, except for a young man eating a sandwich and scrolling through his phone. Caleb checked his watch. 5:47 p.m., 13 minutes early. His phone showed the final transaction of the day. $156, Citizens Bank, 234 Cambridge Street. He pulled up the details. A security deposit. She'd found an apartment, or at least she was trying to. You came back. Caleb spun around. Lena stood 10 feet away, her daughter beside her. Both looked different, cleaner, warmer, more solid somehow. The girl wore a bright purple winter coat that was actually her size, and Lena had replaced her duct-taped boots with something weatherproof. But what struck Caleb most was Lena's expression. Not grateful, not apologetic, just tired and resolute and present in a way that suggested she'd made her choices and would stand by them. "I said I would," Caleb managed. "People say lots of things." Lena walked closer, and Caleb noticed she was holding something, an envelope and his credit card. "I brought receipts, every purchase. I thought you'd want to see them." "I've been watching the transactions all day." "Of course you have." Lena held out the card. "Thank you, for whatever that was. The test, or the charity, or the social experiment. My daughter has winter clothes now. She has medicine. We have food for 2 weeks. So thank you." Caleb didn't take the card. "The donation to the women's shelter. Why?" "Why not?" "Because you have nothing. You're homeless. You have a child to feed. Any rational person would..." "Would what?" Lena's eyes flashed. "Would only think about themselves? Would grab everything they could and never look back? Is that what you expected?" "I don't know what I expected," Caleb admitted. "Yes, you do. You expected me to fail your test. You expected me to prove whatever dark thing you already believed about people like me." Lena shifted the envelope in her hands. "The shelter gave me a bed when I had nowhere else to go. They gave my daughter breakfast when I couldn't. I had access to unlimited money for 1 day. Of course, I paid them back." "You could have paid them back much more." "I could have done a lot of things. I could have bought myself a car, or paid a year's rent, or opened a savings account with your credit card, and secured my daughter's future. I thought about all of it." Lena stepped closer. "But I also thought about what would happen tomorrow when the card was gone. Would I have built anything real? Or would I have just delayed the problem while making myself into the kind of person I don't want to be?" Caleb found he couldn't speak. This woman, this stranger he'd made assumptions about based on nothing more than her circumstances, was articulating a philosophy of dignity that he'd spent his entire career dismissing as naive. "The world isn't divided into people who have and people who don't," Lena continued. "It's divided into people who understand that character isn't about what you do when you're comfortable. It's about who you remain when you're desperate. You gave me a chance to prove I'm still the person I want to be. So I did." She pressed the card into his hand. Her fingers were cold, and he realized she'd been waiting outside for him, making sure she could return what she'd been given. "Where will you go tonight?" Caleb asked quietly. "I put a deposit down on a room. Nothing permanent, but it's warm and safe for the next month. I've got 3 job interviews this week. I used your card to print resumes at a copy shop and pay for a month of phone service so they can reach me. Maybe one of them will work out, maybe not, but that's tomorrow's problem." "The card has no limit," Caleb said. "You could have isn't the same as should have." Lena glanced down at her daughter, who was watching the exchange with solemn brown eyes. "I want Emma to grow up knowing that having integrity isn't conditional. It doesn't turn off when things are hard. It's not something you can afford or not afford. It's who you are." Caleb looked at the card in his hand, feeling its weight differently than he had that morning. When he'd offered it, it had been a test of Lena's character. Now he understood it had been a test of his own. "I was wrong," he said simply. "About what?" "About everything. About people. About what poverty means. About what separates the successful from the struggling." He met her eyes. "I thought having nothing made you dangerous. It doesn't. It just makes you human. It's having everything that made me something less." Lena studied him for a long moment. "What are you going to do with that information?" Caleb didn't have an answer. He looked at this woman who'd been given everything and chosen dignity over comfort, at her daughter who'd watched her mother make the hard right choice instead of the easy wrong one. Then he looked at the card in his hand, this symbol of everything his life had become, and made a decision that would have been impossible 12 hours ago. "Keep it," he said, offering the card back to Lena. "What?" "Keep the card. Not forever, but longer than a day. Long enough to build something real." Lena stepped back, shaking her head. "I can't." "You can. You proved you can." Caleb held the card steady. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering partnership. You showed me that character exists independent of circumstance. Now show me what happens when character gets resources to work with.
Why would you do this? Because, Caleb said slowly, for the first time in decades, I met someone who taught me something worth more than money. And because I have a daughter who stopped speaking to me because I forgot how to see people as anything other than assets or liabilities. And because this morning I gave you a test. You passed it. Now I want to know if I can pass mine. Lena looked down at her daughter, then back at Caleb. What test? Whether someone who's succeeded by trusting no one can learn to trust someone who's survived by being trustworthy. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of the harbor and the sound of traffic and the ambient noise of a city preparing for night. On the platform below them, a train arrived and departed. People moved through their lives, unaware that somewhere above them, two strangers were conducting a test whose results would ripple far beyond this moment. One condition, Lena said finally. Name it. I keep the receipts. You get full transparency. Every purchase, every decision. This isn't a blank check. It's an investment in something neither of us fully understands yet. But it has to be honest. Caleb felt something loosen in his chest, some knot of suspicion and fear that had been wound tight for so long he'd forgotten it was there. Deal, he said. They shook hands, two people from completely different worlds, connected by a black credit card and a shared willingness to believe that character might matter more than circumstance, that dignity might be more valuable than wealth, that the distance between success and struggle might be far smaller than either of them had imagined. When Lena and Emma disappeared into the subway station, Caleb remained on the street, watching them go. His phone buzzed with messages: Marcus, Jennifer, Richard, Emily, the board members and financial reporters, and all the machinery of his empire demanding attention. He ignored all of it. Instead, he pulled up his transaction history and watched the day's activity scroll past. $623.43 in direct purchases. $125 in charitable giving, $156 in security deposit. Grand total, $904.43. Less than $1,000 had revealed more about human nature than 43 years of ruthless capitalism. And somewhere in the arithmetic of that disparity, Caleb Monroe began to understand the true poverty of his success. He turned up his collar against the cold and walked toward the subway entrance. Tomorrow would bring explanations and damage control, board meetings and press releases, all the defensive structures his life required to maintain the fiction that he was in control. But tonight, he was just a man who'd met a woman with nothing and learned she had everything he'd been missing. The test had begun. And for the first time in decades, Caleb Monroe wasn't certain he knew the answer. The first transaction after Caleb's decision to let Lena keep the card appeared at 7:23 the following morning. $89 at a thrift store on Massachusetts Avenue. He was in his home office when the notification arrived, having barely slept, and he found himself holding his breath as he opened the details. Women's interview clothes, a blazer, slacks, 2 blouses, all secondhand, all practical, all under $100. He exhaled slowly and set down his coffee. His phone rang almost immediately. Marcus, of course. The man seemed to have alerts set for every unusual movement in Caleb's financial life. Please tell me you got the card back, Marcus said without preamble. I didn't. So she still has unlimited access to your personal credit line? Yes. And you're comfortable with this? Caleb watched the sunrise paint his penthouse walls gold and crimson. Comfortable isn't the word I'd use, but yes, I'm proceeding with this arrangement. For how long? I don't know yet. Marcus was quiet for a moment. The board is asking questions, Caleb. Thompson called me last night. He wants to know if you're having some kind of crisis. Tell him I'm having the opposite of a crisis. I'm having a moment of clarity. That's not going to reassure him. It's not meant to, Caleb said. Schedule an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. I'll address their concerns then. He ended the call before Marcus could protest and pulled up Lena's contact information. He'd added her number to his phone the night before, along with a simple note. Character multiplies meaning. Now he typed out a message. Saw the purchase this morning. Good luck with the interviews. The response came back faster than he expected. Thank you. First one is at 10. Nervous. Caleb stared at that single word. nervous. When was the last time he'd admitted to nervousness about anything? When had his world become so insulated that anxiety was something he simply outsourced to subordinates? "You'll do great," he typed. Then after a pause, "Let me know how it goes?" 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Why are you doing this? It was the question everyone kept asking. The question he still didn't have a complete answer for. But sitting there in his penthouse, watching the city wake up 30 floors below, Caleb found himself typing the most honest response he could manage. "Because yesterday you showed me who I used to be before I forgot, and I want to remember." The 3 dots appeared again, held for a long time, then vanished without a response. Caleb set down his phone and turned to face his wall of windows. His reflection stared back at him, a man in expensive loungewear, surrounded by the trappings of extraordinary success, completely alone in a space designed to announce his separation from the common struggle. The irony wasn't lost on him. His daughter Emily had once asked him, during one of their increasingly rare dinners, what the view from the top looked like. He'd thought she was making small talk. Now he understood she'd been asking whether he could still see the ground. At 9:47 a.m., Caleb was in a video conference with his acquisition team when another notification arrived. $8.50 at a Starbucks. He smiled slightly, imagining Lena arriving early for her interview, buying coffee to steady her nerves, maybe practicing her answers one more time. It was such a small thing, such a human thing, and yet in the context of unlimited credit, it revealed everything about restraint and proportion. Jennifer Wu noticed his distraction. "Caleb, did you hear the question about the Manchester timeline?" "Postpone it," he said. "Postpone the acquisition?" "Yes." "For how long?" "Indefinitely. I want a full impact analysis on the job losses, not just the numbers, actual people, names, ages, how long they've worked there, what they'll do if we eliminate their positions." The conference room went silent. His acquisition team exchanged glances that ranged from confused to alarmed. "That's not standard due diligence," Jennifer said carefully. "It is now. I want to know what it costs in human terms, not just financial ones. But that will take weeks, maybe months. Then it takes months." Caleb leaned forward. "I've spent 20 years measuring success by quarterly returns and stock price. I'm starting to think we've been calculating with the wrong variables." After the meeting ended, Jennifer lingered while the others filed out. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. "Everyone keeps asking me that." "Because you're acting like someone who's fundamentally changed overnight. And in my experience, that kind of transformation either means enlightenment or breakdown. I'm hoping it's the former." Caleb considered her words. "What if it's both?" "Then I guess we hold on tight and see where this goes." At 11:23 a.m., his phone buzzed with a text from Lena. "Didn't get the first job. They wanted someone with more recent experience. 2 more interviews this afternoon." Caleb felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. He started to type words of encouragement, then stopped. This wasn't his journey to manage or his disappointment to process. Lena had been handling rejection and setback long before he'd handed her a credit card. What she probably needed wasn't platitudes but space. "Thank you for the update," he typed simply. "I'm here if you need anything." The response came back. "I need to figure out how to explain a 2-year gap in my employment history without making them uncomfortable." Caleb stared at that message. 2 years. 2 years of homelessness, of survival, of keeping a child safe and fed without the infrastructure most people took for granted. 2 years that employers would see as a liability rather than a testament to resourcefulness and strength. "Tell them the truth," he typed. "You were dealing with a family emergency that required your full attention. You managed complex logistics with minimal resources. You maintained responsibility for another person's complete well-being. You developed advanced problem-solving skills in high-pressure situations. If they can't see that as valuable experience, they're not worth working for." This time the 3 dots appeared immediately. That's easy to say when you're not the one who needs the job. Fair point. Caleb sat back, humbled by the reminder that his perspective came from a position of absolute security. He could afford to be idealistic about honest interviews because he'd never faced the terror of choosing between dignity and survival. "You're right," he typed. "I apologize. Tell them whatever you need to tell them to get the job. I trust your judgment." A longer pause this time, then, "No, you were right the first time. I'll tell them the truth. If that costs me the job, at least I'll still have myself." Caleb felt something shift in his chest. This woman, who had every practical reason to compromise, was choosing integrity over expedience, not because it was easy or smart, but because it was who she was. His phone rang. Emily. "Dad? I just talked to Marcus. He says you're having some kind of existential crisis." "Marcus worries too much. He says you're giving away money to strangers and postponing major acquisitions to study the human impact. That doesn't sound like the father I know." "Maybe the father you know needs updating." Emily was quiet for a moment. "What's her name?" "Who?" "The woman with the credit card. The one who's apparently turning your worldview upside down." "Lena Parker. She has a 6-year-old daughter named Emma." "And you trust her? Completely? With unlimited access to your money?" Caleb thought about the receipts, the careful purchases, the donation to the shelter, the secondhand interview clothes. "More than I trust most of the people I do business with." "That's either beautiful or insane. Your mother said the same thing about marrying me, and she was right on both counts." Emily laughed, the sound bright and unexpected. "I haven't heard you make a self-deprecating joke in years." "I'm trying something new. It's called humility. I'm not very good at it yet." "Well, keep trying. It suits you better than arrogance ever did." Emily paused. "Dad, I'm proud of you. I don't know where this is going, but I'm proud that you're asking different questions." After she hung up, Caleb sat in his office and felt something he hadn't experienced in longer than he could remember. The warm uncertainty of not knowing what came next and being okay with that. At 2:15 p.m., another transaction, $15.50 at a bodega. He pulled up the itemized receipt, a sandwich, juice, and a small toy for Emma. Lunch between interviews, purchased with the kind of efficiency that spoke to years of making every dollar count. At 4:47 p.m., $12 for subway fare cards. At 6:33 p.m., $67 at a grocery store. Each purchase was modest, considered, necessary. No tests of the limit, no pushing boundaries. Just a woman using resources responsibly while trying to rebuild a life. His phone rang at 7:15. Lena. "I got a job," she said, and he could hear the tremor in her voice. Relief, exhaustion, disbelief all mixed together. The third interview. It's front desk at a medical clinic. "They want me to start Monday." "That's wonderful," Caleb said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised him. "It's minimum wage plus benefits, which means health insurance for Emma, which means she can see a dentist, and I can finally get her caught up on vaccinations, and—" Lena's voice cracked. "I'm sorry. I'm being ridiculous." "You're not being ridiculous. You're being human." The manager asked about my work gap. I told her the truth, like you said, about being homeless, about keeping Emma safe, about managing logistics and problem solving and all of it. She just looked at me for a long time, and I thought I'd blown it. Then she said her sister had been homeless for 6 months after an abusive relationship, and that anyone who could keep a child fed and in school while living on the street was exactly the kind of resourceful employee she needed. Caleb found his throat tight. "You did that yourself, not the card, not me. You." "Maybe. But you gave me the space to try." Lena took a shaky breath. "I'm going to pay you back. Every dollar I've spent. I don't know how long it will take, but I'll do it." "That's not necessary." "It is to me." They were both quiet for a moment. Through the phone, Caleb could hear the background noise of wherever Lena was. Traffic, voices, the ambient sound of public space. His own office was silent except for the hum of climate control and the distant whisper of the city far below. "Where are you right now?" he asked. "McDonald's on Cambridge Street. They have Wi-Fi and Emma likes the play area. I've been letting her burn off energy while I figure out our next steps." "Your next steps?" "The room I rented is only temporary. I need to find actual housing before the month runs out. Something affordable on a minimum wage salary, which in Boston basically doesn't exist. But that's a tomorrow problem. Tonight, I'm just going to celebrate the fact that I have a job." Caleb made a decision. What if housing wasn't a tomorrow problem? What if we solved it now? We? I own property, a lot of it. Some residential units that Monroe Holdings acquired in various deals. Most of them sit empty while we decide what to do with the buildings. Let me see what's available. Caleb, I can't just market rate, he interrupted. Whatever you can afford on your new salary. No charity, no favors, just a landlord renting to a tenant who's proven she's responsible. Why? It was the same question, always the same question, and Caleb still didn't have a complete answer. But he was learning that maybe the answer was less important than the willingness to keep asking. Because yesterday you were a test of my assumptions, he said quietly. Today, you're a person I'm choosing to know. And tomorrow, you'll be someone I'm glad I helped. Not because it makes me feel good about myself, but because you deserve help, and I'm in a position to provide it. But Lena was quiet for so long that Caleb thought the call might have dropped. Okay, she finally said. Market rate. But I sign a real lease, and if I can't pay, I get evicted like anyone else. No special treatment. Deal. After they hung up, Caleb pulled up his property management database and started scrolling through residential units. Most were in buildings slated for redevelopment or conversion to commercial space, the kind of holdings that made financial sense but erased communities in the process. He found himself looking at them differently now, seeing not just square footage and location value, but the lives that had been displaced to accommodate his profit margins. One building caught his attention, a small apartment complex in Jamaica Plain that Monroe Holdings had acquired 3 years ago. The plan had been to flip it into luxury condos, but the project had stalled in permit negotiations. 15 units sitting empty, slowly deteriorating, waiting for someone to decide their fate. Caleb opened the detailed files. The building was old but structurally sound. The neighborhood had good schools, parks, public transportation. It was exactly the kind of place where someone making minimum wage might be able to afford rent if the landlord wasn't trying to maximize returns. He called his property manager, a gruff man named Tom Chen, who'd worked for Monroe Holdings for a decade. Tom, the Jamaica Plain building on Burroughs Street. What's the status? Still waiting on the city. They're being difficult about the zoning changes. Why? How many units are currently livable? All of them, technically. They need updates, but they're safe and functional. We've been keeping utilities on for security reasons. I want to rent one, 2-bedroom if possible. Tom was quiet for a moment. Rent? To who? A single mother with a child. She's starting a new job, needs stable housing. You want to rent a unit in a building we're planning to redevelop? I'm starting to think we need to reconsider that plan. But yes, for now, I want to rent one unit. Market rate for the neighborhood, what would that be? For a 2-bedroom in Jamaica Plain? Maybe $1,300 if it's updated. But these units haven't been updated, so probably closer to $1,000. Set it at $950, and I want a month-to-month lease with 60 days notice on either side. Caleb, am I what? Are you okay? This isn't like you. Everyone keeps saying that, Caleb said tiredly. Maybe who I was before wasn't worth being like. He texted Lena the address and details. Her response came back within minutes. I can't believe this is real. It's real. Can you look at it tomorrow? Yes, we'll go after Emma's school. Emma's school. Of course the child was in school. Of course Lena had somehow maintained that stability, even while homeless. The woman's capacity for managing impossible circumstances was staggering. That night, Caleb sat in his penthouse and tried to remember the last time he'd done something that wasn't calculated for maximum return. The last time he'd made a decision based on what felt right rather than what made financial sense. The last time he'd allowed himself to be moved by someone else's struggle without seeing it as either opportunity or weakness. He couldn't remember, which meant it had been too long. His phone buzzed with a photo message from Lena. Emma, smiling in her new purple coat, holding up a drawing she'd made. The subject was immediately recognizable. 2 stick figures, one tall and one small, standing under what appeared to be a very enthusiastic sun. The caption read, "She wanted you to see her drawing. She says you're the tall one, and she's the small one, and the sun is there because today was a happy day." Caleb stared at that drawing for a long time. A child he'd met once for barely 5 minutes had included him in her picture of happiness, not as a distant benefactor or abstract helper, but as a person present in her life, tall enough to matter, but close enough to draw. He saved the image to his phone and then did something he hadn't done in years. He printed it out and put it on his desk where he'd see it every morning. The next day, Caleb stood in front of his board of directors and waited for the inevitable interrogation. Richard Thompson, the board chairman, got straight to the point. "We're concerned, Caleb. Marcus tells us you've halted the Manchester acquisition. Jennifer says you're requesting unprecedented levels of human impact analysis for routine deals. And there are reports of unusual personal financial activity that's raised questions about your decision-making." "My decision-making is sound," Caleb said calmly. "Then explain the Manchester delay." "We're talking about a $12 million opportunity that you yourself identified." "I identified it based on numbers. I didn't look at people." "Since when do we look at people?" Thompson's tone was sharp. "We look at assets, liabilities, and returns. That's the job." "Maybe the job needs to change." The room erupted in overlapping voices. Caleb let them talk over each other for a moment before raising his hand for silence. "I met someone this week," he said quietly. "Someone who has nothing. And in one day, she taught me more about value and character than I've learned in 20 years of acquiring companies. She was given unlimited resources and used them with more wisdom and restraint than this board has shown in our last 10 major decisions." "This is about a homeless woman?" Thompson looked incredulous. "You're reconsidering our entire business strategy because of one anecdotal interaction?" "No. I'm reconsidering our business strategy because that one interaction revealed how narrow our definition of success has become. We measure everything in quarterly returns. We celebrate efficiency that destroys lives. We call it smart business when we're really just calling it acceptable harm." "That's naive," another board member, Patricia Vance, no relation to his therapist, interjected. "We're not a charity, Caleb. We're a private equity firm. Our job is to maximize returns for our investors." "And what are we returning to them? Money they'll use to make more money they don't need? While people with actual needs, people with talent and drive and character are ground up in the process." Caleb looked at each board member in turn. "I'm not suggesting we become a charity. I'm suggesting we consider whether there might be more than one way to define success." "This is insanity," Thompson said flatly. "You're letting personal emotions corrupt professional judgment. Or maybe I've let professional judgment corrupt my humanity for so long that I forgot it was there." The meeting devolved into argument. Some board members sided with Thompson, others seemed intrigued by Caleb's shift in perspective, and a few appeared simply confused. By the time it ended, no consensus had been reached except that Caleb remained CEO and the Manchester deal would be delayed pending further analysis. As everyone filed out, Marcus lingered. "You're going to lose them," he said quietly. "Keep pushing this direction and the board will vote you out." "Then they vote me out." "You built this company, Caleb. It's your legacy." "That's what I'm afraid of," Caleb said. "That this, all of this, is what I'll be remembered for. Not as someone who helped people, but as someone who is very efficient at extracting value from their suffering." Marcus studied him with an expression Caleb couldn't quite read. "The woman with the credit card, Lena. What happens when this experiment ends? What happens when you realize she's just one person and you can't fix everyone's problems?" "I'm not trying to fix everyone's problems. I'm trying to fix my own." That afternoon, Caleb met Lena and Emma at the Jamaica Plain apartment. Tom had sent someone to do a basic cleaning, but the space still bore the marks of neglect, scuffed floors, outdated fixtures, walls that needed paint. To Caleb, it looked shabby. To Lena, it looked like everything. "It has 2 bedrooms, she said, her voice wonder-struck. "Emma can have her own room, and a bathtub, a real bathtub where she can take baths instead of washing in sinks." Emma was already running from room to room, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. She appeared in the doorway of what would be her bedroom, eyes huge. "Mama, can I really have this room? Just for me?" "Yes, baby, just for you." The child disappeared again, and Caleb heard her talking to herself in the other room, already narrating the life she'd live here. "I'll need furniture," Lena said, more to herself than to Caleb, "but I can get stuff at Goodwill, and we'll need dishes and pots and pans. But there's a dollar store nearby, and I start work Monday, so first paycheck I can—" "Lena." She stopped mid-planning and looked at him. "The building has storage units in the basement," Caleb said. full of furniture from previous tenants. Nothing fancy, but it's all serviceable. Take whatever you need. I can't just... You can. It's sitting unused. Consider it part of the lease. Lena looked at him for a long moment, and Caleb saw her calculating, weighing pride against practicality, dignity against need. Finally, she nodded. Okay, but I'm painting everything myself, and any repairs that come up, I handle them if I can before calling you. This is my home, and I take care of my home. Fair enough. They stood in the empty living room while Emma's voice drifted from the bedroom, already making plans, already building a future. Sunlight came through the windows in dusty columns, illuminating the worn carpet and the water stain on the ceiling and the crack in the corner where the walls met. This is the nicest place I've lived in 3 years, Lena said quietly. Caleb felt the weight of that statement settle over him. This shabby, neglected apartment was a palace to someone who'd spent so long with nothing. The gap between their realities was so vast that he couldn't even calibrate his response. I'm glad you like it, he said, because anything else felt inadequate. Lena turned to face him fully. Why are you really doing this? And don't give me the answer about testing assumptions or learning lessons. Why you, specifically with your resources and your empire and your life that doesn't need to include people like me? It was the most direct version of the question anyone had asked, and it deserved an honest answer. Because 3 days ago, I was standing in my office looking out at the city, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd done something that actually mattered, Caleb said slowly. Not something that made money or impressed people or built my reputation, something that mattered. And then you showed me what mattering looks like. You have nothing, and you still choose to give. You face rejection, and you still choose dignity. You're scared, and you still choose truth. You're everything I've spent my whole life telling myself didn't exist. I'm not perfect, Lena said. I've made mistakes. I've been angry and bitter, and sometimes I've hated people who had what I couldn't have. That makes you human, not flawed. The difference is, you didn't let that anger define your actions. You could have used my card to take revenge on a world that's been cruel to you. You chose kindness instead. That's not naivety. That's strength I don't have. Emma appeared again, tugging on Lena's sleeve. Mama, can we stay here tonight, please? Lena looked down at her daughter, then around at the empty apartment. We don't have beds yet, sweetie. We can sleep on the floor, like camping. I'll have beds delivered this afternoon, Caleb said, and basic supplies, linens, towels, kitchen essentials. You shouldn't have to camp in your own home. Caleb, market rate, he reminded her gently. You'll pay it all back through rent. I'm just advancing you the furniture. Consider it a signing bonus. Lena's jaw tightened, and for a moment Caleb thought she might refuse. Then Emma hugged her leg, and something in Lena's expression softened. Okay. Thank you. By evening, the apartment had been transformed. Tom had sent over 2 beds, a small dining table, a couch from the basement storage, and boxes of donated kitchen supplies. Lena and Emma had been to Target, $287 on the credit card, for sheets, pillows, and groceries. The space still looked bare, but it looked lived in. It looked like home. Caleb stood in the doorway, watching Lena make up Emma's bed while the girl bounced excitedly on the mattress. He felt like an intruder in their moment, an outsider to an intimacy he'd never quite managed in his own family life. You should go, Lena said, not unkindly. We've taken enough of your time. I don't mind. I know, but Emma and I need to do this part ourselves. We need to learn this space together, just the 2 of us. She was right, of course. Caleb nodded and turned to leave. Caleb? He looked back. Thank you for seeing me when you didn't have to. He drove back to his penthouse through evening traffic, his mind full of images. Emma's drawing, Lena's careful purchases, the empty apartment transformed into a home. Somewhere in the city behind him, a woman and her daughter were sleeping in their own beds for the first time in years, and Caleb Monroe had made that possible not through charity, but through choice. The choice to see clearly, to act without calculating return, to believe that character could exist anywhere if you were willing to look for it. His phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. Board is meeting tomorrow without you. Thompson is pushing for a vote of no confidence. Thought you should know. Caleb read the message twice, then set down his phone. He should have been worried, should have been strategizing, should have been calculating how to maintain power and control. Instead, he felt strangely peaceful, because for the first time in his professional life, he'd done something that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet or explained in a quarterly report. He'd helped someone who needed help, for no reason except that it was right. And if that cost him everything he'd built, at least he'd finally built something worth losing. The vote of no confidence came 3 days later, on a Thursday morning that dawned gray and bitter. Caleb arrived at Monroe Holdings headquarters to find the building humming with tension, executives and assistants speaking in hushed clusters that fell silent as he passed. Marcus met him at the elevator with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that suggested neither would be enough to get through what was coming. "They've been here since 7, Marcus said quietly as they rode up. "Thompson brought in outside counsel. He's not playing around." "Neither am I." "Caleb, you need to understand what's at stake. If they vote you out, you lose operational control. You'll still own shares, but you won't run the company. Everything you've built." "I know what I'll lose." Caleb took the coffee and watched the floor numbers climb. "The question is whether what I've built is worth keeping." Marcus stared at him. 2 weeks ago, you would have fought this with everything you had. But 2 weeks ago, I thought power was the same thing as purpose. The conference room was packed. All 12 board members sat around the long table, flanked by attorneys and advisors. Richard Thompson occupied Caleb's usual seat at the head, a deliberate positioning that announced his intentions. The air smelled like expensive cologne and quiet aggression. "Caleb," Thompson said, his voice carrying the false warmth of someone about to fire you. "Thank you for coming." "It's my company, Richard. Where else would I be?" "That's precisely what we need to discuss. Whether this is still your company, given recent decisions that suggest a fundamental departure from our core mission and fiduciary responsibilities." Caleb set down his coffee and remained standing. "You want to remove me because I delayed one acquisition and requested human impact analysis. That's your case? We want to remove you because you've demonstrated a pattern of erratic behavior that prioritizes personal sentiment over shareholder value." Thompson opened a folder. "In the past 10 days, you've halted 3 major deals representing over $30 million in projected returns. You've demanded new evaluation criteria that have no precedent in our industry. And according to our financial monitoring systems, you've engaged in highly irregular personal transactions that suggest impaired judgment." The room went silent. Caleb felt every eye on him, measuring his response. "You've been monitoring my personal accounts?" "We have an obligation to ensure our CEO's financial decisions don't compromise his ability to lead. When someone with access to sensitive corporate information starts exhibiting unusual behavior, we investigate." "And what did your investigation reveal, Richard?" Thompson glanced at his notes. "That you gave your unlimited credit card to a homeless woman. That you're providing her with housing from company assets. That you've been in daily contact with someone who, according to our background check, has significant financial vulnerabilities that could theoretically be exploited." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Caleb felt his jaw tighten. "You ran a background check on Lena Parker?" "We ran appropriate due diligence on someone who suddenly gained access to your financial resources and your attention. The results are concerning. History of financial instability, eviction records, a gap in employment that corresponds with—" "Stop!" Caleb's voice cut through the room. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to reduce someone's trauma and survival to liability metrics." "We're not reducing anything," Thompson said calmly. "We're protecting this company from a CEO whose personal entanglements have compromised his objectivity. Your recent behavior isn't visionary, Caleb. It's reckless. And recklessness is grounds for removal." Patricia Vance, the board member, not his therapist, spoke up. "Caleb, we're not questioning your intelligence or your track record. We're questioning whether you're still capable of making decisions in the company's best interest when you're clearly emotionally invested in an outside situation." "What if the company's best interest isn't what we've been calling it?" Caleb asked quietly. "I'm sorry?" "What if 20 years of maximizing extraction and minimizing human cost has built something financially successful but fundamentally hollow? What if we've been winning by measures that don't actually matter?" Thompson closed his folder with deliberate precision. "This is exactly what we're talking about. Philosophical meandering instead of strategic thinking. questioning foundational principles instead of executing on them. You're having a midlife crisis, Caleb, and we can't let you drag this company through it. Then vote, Caleb said simply. Take your vote of no confidence. Remove me if that's what you think leadership requires. But know this, I'm not having a crisis. I'm having a correction, and history will show which one of us was actually serving the company's interests. The vote took less than 10 minutes. 8 in favor of removing Caleb as CEO, 3 opposed, 1 abstention. Thompson's face remained professionally neutral, but Caleb saw the satisfaction in his eyes. The king was dead. Long live the king. Marcus caught up with Caleb in the hallway outside his office. I'm sorry, Marcus said, and actually meant it. I tried to make the case for delay, for giving you time to... It's fine, Marcus. They made their choice. Now I get to make mine. What choice? You just lost operational control of the company you founded. I lost control of a machine I built to extract value. Now, I'm free to build something that creates it. Caleb started packing his personal items. Photos of Emily, the drawing from Emma, a few books that had survived multiple office moves. How much notice do you need? Notice for what? You're coming with me. Marcus blinked. What? You're my CFO, Marcus. I'm starting something new, and I need someone who understands both the numbers and the purpose behind them. Unless you want to stay here and optimize Thompson's quarterly returns. Marcus ran his hand through his hair. You're serious. You're actually starting over. I'm starting better. Caleb picked up Emma's drawing and studied it, 2 stick figures under a happy sun. I spent 20 years building an empire that made money but didn't matter. Now I'm going to build something that matters, even if it makes less money. You in? Marcus looked at the drawing, then at Caleb, then back at the conference room where the board was probably already celebrating their victory. What exactly are we building? I have no idea, but I know it starts with housing people like Lena instead of extracting equity from their neighborhoods. And I know it ends with measuring success by lives changed instead of returns maximized. Everything in between we'll figure out together. For a long moment, Marcus just stared at him. Then, slowly, he smiled. My wife is going to think I've lost my mind. Probably. But at least you'll know what you're losing it for. They walked out of Monroe Holdings together, 2 men leaving behind everything they'd built to attempt something neither fully understood. The lobby was full of employees who'd heard about the vote, their faces showing everything from sympathy to schadenfreude. Caleb nodded to a few, shook hands with others, and tried not to think about how many of them had defined their careers by his success and would now have to explain its absence. His phone buzzed as they stepped into the cold afternoon. Lena. I just saw the news. They're reporting you were removed as CEO. Are you okay? Caleb looked up at the Monroe Holdings Tower, his name still on the building even though his power inside it had been stripped away. He felt lighter than he had in years. I'm better than okay. I'm free. That evening, Caleb sat in Lena's apartment drinking coffee from mismatched mugs while Emma did homework at the kitchen table. The space had transformed over the past week, curtains on the windows, pictures on the walls, the accumulated debris of living that turned empty rooms into homes. It smelled like cooking and childhood, and the particular warmth that comes from people who've learned not to take shelter for granted. You didn't have to lose your company because of me, Lena said quietly. I didn't lose it because of you. I lost it because I finally understood what it had cost me. Caleb watched Emma concentrating on her math worksheet, tongue between her teeth. They saw my change as weakness. Maybe it is, but it's a weakness I can live with. What will you do now? Something different, something that uses capital to build instead of extract. I own enough property in this city to house 100 families like yours. What if we actually did that? What if we created housing that people could afford, in buildings that we maintain properly, with leases that don't punish poverty? Lena set down her mug. That's not a business model. That's a social service. Maybe the line between them isn't as clear as I thought. Maybe there's a way to do both, to run something sustainably while measuring success by impact instead of profit. You'd need funding, infrastructure, people who understand both housing and social work.
I'd need a partner, Caleb corrected. Someone who knows what affordable housing actually requires because they've lived the absence of it. Someone who understands what policies help and which ones hurt because they've been on the receiving end. Lena looked at him sharply. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a partnership. You bring the lived experience and the insight. I bring the capital and the connections. Together we build something that doesn't exist yet. Housing as dignity instead of commodity. I just started at the clinic 4 days ago. I know. And if you're happy there, you should stay. But if you want to help solve the problem systemically, instead of treating its symptoms one person at a time, I'm offering you that chance. Emma looked up from her homework. Mama, what's a partnership? It's when two people work together to build something neither could build alone, Lena said softly, her eyes still on Caleb. Like you and Mr. Caleb? Maybe, baby. Maybe exactly like that. After Emma went to bed, Lena and Caleb sat in the small living room and sketched out possibilities. Not a business plan yet. Neither of them knew enough about what they were attempting to formalize it, but the bones of something. Housing first, because that was the foundation everything else required. Job training second, because stability needed income. Healthcare access third, because poverty without medical support was a death spiral. It sounds expensive, Lena said, reviewing their rough notes. It is expensive, but you know what's more expensive. The current system. Emergency room visits instead of preventive care, shelters instead of permanent housing, foster care instead of family support. We're already paying these costs. We're just paying them in the worst possible way. And you think you can convince other wealthy people to fund this? I don't know, but I know I can try. And I know that even if only a fraction of them care, that fraction represents more capital than most countries' GDP. Lena was quiet for a moment. This could fail. You could spend everything you have and accomplish nothing. I could, but I already spent 20 years accomplishing nothing that mattered. At least this way, if I fail, I'll fail at something worth attempting. The next morning, Caleb woke to 17 missed calls from reporters, 34 emails from business contacts offering condolences or advice, and one text from his daughter that simply read, "Proud of you, Dad. Let's have breakfast." They met at a diner in Cambridge, the kind of place Caleb hadn't visited in years because it didn't have valet parking or cloth napkins. Emily was already there when he arrived, sitting in a booth by the window, looking more like her mother than ever. "You're trending on Twitter," she said as he slid in across from her. "Half the business world thinks you've had a breakdown. The other half thinks you're a visionary who's about to revolutionize impact investing. What do you think?" "I think you're my dad, and for the first time in my life, I actually recognize the person behind that title." The waitress arrived, an older woman with a name tag that said Ruth, and took their orders with the efficient kindness of someone who'd spent decades serving breakfast to strangers. After she left, Emily leaned forward. "Tell me about her, the woman everyone's talking about." Caleb told her. Not just the facts of Lena's situation, but the truth of who she was, her dignity, her choices, the way she'd revealed to him what character actually looked like when it wasn't cushioned by privilege. He told her about Emma's drawing and the modest purchases and the donation to the shelter that had broken open his assumptions about human nature. "You love her," Emily said. "What? No, I barely know her." "I didn't say you're in love with her. I said you love her. There's a difference. You love who she is and what she represents. You love that she proved you wrong, and you're rebuilding your entire life around that love." Caleb started to protest, then stopped. His daughter was right. He did love Lena, but not romantically. He loved her the way you love anyone who shows you truth you'd been avoiding. He loved her as a mirror that reflected back his own poverty of imagination. "I'm starting a housing initiative," he said instead, "using my property holdings to create affordable units. Lena's going to help me design it so it actually serves the people who need it instead of just looking good on paper." "How will you fund it?" "I'm starting a foundation. I'll seed it with my own capital, then reach out to other investors who might be interested in measuring returns differently." Emily smiled. "You mean you're going to spend your severance changing the world?" "I'm going to spend my severance trying. The world might not cooperate." Their food arrived, and they ate in comfortable silence for a while. Caleb watched his daughter, this fierce, intelligent woman he'd somehow raised despite doing almost everything wrong,
and felt a surge of gratitude that she'd given him enough chances to finally get something right. "Dad," Emily said quietly, "you know most people don't change like this. Most people double down on who they've always been. What made you different?" Caleb thought about that morning in the subway station, the cold wind and the sleeping child and the decision to hand over a credit card instead of walking past. He thought about every transaction since then, each one a small revelation about who people were when they had nothing to prove. "I think I'd been waiting my whole life to be proven wrong," he said finally. "I just needed someone brave enough to do it." The foundation took shape over the following weeks. Caleb liquidated assets, converted holdings, restructured investments. Marcus set up the financial architecture while Lana designed the actual programs, drawing on her own experience to identify what helped and what hurt. They called it the Cornerstone Initiative because housing was the corner on which everything else could be built. The Jamaica Plain building became their pilot project. Instead of converting it to luxury condos, they renovated the 15 units into affordable housing. Not luxury, but dignified. Updated appliances, fresh paint, secure locks, spaces where people could build lives instead of just survive them. The rent was set at 30% of income, with lease terms designed to support stability rather than punish vulnerability. "It's not enough," Lena said as they toured the nearly finished building. 15 units in a city that needs 15,000. "Every movement starts with one step," Caleb replied. "This is ours." They held an open house on a Saturday in March, when the weather had finally started to hint at spring. The response overwhelmed them. 73 applications for 15 units, each one representing a story of near homelessness, of working full-time and still not affording Boston rent, of families one crisis away from losing everything. Caleb stood in the lobby reading applications and felt the weight of all that need pressing against the inadequacy of their response. 15 units, 15 families. What about the other 58? "We can't save everyone," Lena said, reading his expression. "Why not?" "Because there's not enough of us and too much of the problem." "Then we need more of us." That night, Caleb drafted an open letter to Boston's philanthropic community. Not asking for donations, asking for transformation. He laid out the mathematics of the current system, showing how much money already flowed toward poverty without actually solving it. He proposed a different model. Housing as infrastructure, stability as investment, dignity as measurable outcome. He named the Cornerstone Initiative as proof of concept and invited anyone interested in scaling the model to join him. The letter went out on Monday. By Tuesday, his inbox was full of responses. Some were dismissive, calling him naive, impractical, a failed CEO trying to buy relevance through guilt. But others were curious, interested. A tech founder who'd grown up in public housing, a doctor who'd seen the health consequences of housing instability, an attorney who'd worked in eviction court and hated every case she won. By Friday, they had a meeting scheduled. 12 people, representing combined net worth in the hundreds of millions, willing to at least hear the pitch. "This is it," Marcus said, reviewing the financials one more time before the meeting. "You convince them. We scale. You don't. Cornerstone stays small and we run out of capital in 18 months. No pressure then. Actually, all the pressure. But you've been preparing for this your whole life. You just didn't know it was leading here." The meeting was held in a conference room that Caleb had rented specifically because it didn't look like the boardrooms where he'd spent his career. No marble, no mahogany, no statement art. Just a functional space with windows that looked out at the city and seating arranged in a circle instead of a hierarchy. The 12 attendees arrived within minutes of each other, mixing wealthy curiosity with skeptical caution. Caleb recognized some faces, people he'd negotiated with or against over the years. Others were new, brought by word of mouth and whatever social currency his name still carried. "Thank you for coming," Caleb began, standing in the center of the circle. "Most of you know me as someone who spent 2 decades extracting value from underpriced assets. What you might not know is that I recently met someone who taught me that the most underpriced assets aren't companies or properties. They're people. And unlike corporate acquisitions, investing in people actually generates returns that matter." He introduced Lena then, stepping aside so she could tell her own story. Not as a victim or a charity case, but as an expert in a system they all funded but few understood. She spoke about the impossible calculations of poverty, The math that punished you for working, the penalties for trying to save, the traps disguised as assistance. She described sleeping in a subway station with her daughter and working 3 jobs that still didn't add up to rent. And she told them about the credit card test, the choices she'd made, and the revelation that changed both their lives. "I'm not here asking for your pity," Lena said. "I'm here offering you an opportunity, the chance to fund something that actually works instead of something that just looks good in annual reports. Housing first, wrapped with support services, measured by sustained stability. It costs more upfront, but less long-term. And it builds communities instead of just reducing statistics." The room was silent when she finished. Then the tech founder, a woman named Jennifer Shaw, who'd made her fortune in cloud computing, spoke up. "What's your success metric?" "People staying housed for 5 years," Lena answered. "Employment stability, children's school attendance and performance, healthcare access and outcomes. We're measuring life change, not just occupancy rates." "And what's your ask?" Caleb stepped forward again. "We need $50 million to scale to 500 units across Boston. That's our first-year goal. Year 2, we replicate the model in 3 other cities. Year 5, we're operating in 20 metropolitan areas and proving the model works at scale. We're not asking for donations. We're offering partnership in building infrastructure that doesn't exist yet." "50 million for affordable housing won't transform the crisis," someone pointed out. "Boston alone has thousands of families in need." "You're right," Caleb agreed. "But it will prove the model. And once we prove it works, we leverage that success to convince others. Cities, states, federal programs. This isn't the solution. It's the demonstration that solutions are possible when we measure success differently." The questions came rapid fire after that. Financial sustainability, scalability, regulatory challenges, political optics. Caleb and Marcus handled the numbers while Lena addressed the human elements, the details that only someone who'd lived it could articulate. They talked for 3 hours, past the scheduled end time, driven by something that felt less like a pitch meeting and more like the birth of shared purpose. When it finally ended, Jennifer Shaw approached Caleb directly. "I'm in for 10 million, she said simply. "Not because the numbers are perfect, they're not, but because I grew up in Section 8 housing and I remember what it felt like when someone finally saw us as people instead of problems. Send me the commitment documents." 3 others made similar pledges before leaving. By the end of the day, they had 23 million committed, not enough for their full vision, but enough to begin. That night, Caleb and Lena sat in her apartment, their apartment really, since he spent more time there now than in his penthouse, and tried to process what had happened. "We just committed to housing 300 families in the next 18 months, Lena said, slightly dazed. 300 families whose lives are about to change because we convinced a room full of rich people to measure success differently. Not we, you. Your story convinced them. I just provided the venue. Don't do that. Don't minimize your role. You're the one who chose to see clearly. Everything else followed from that choice." Emma wandered out of her bedroom, pajama-clad and sleepy. "Mama, why are you still awake? It's late." "I know, baby. We just had a really good day at work. Go back to bed." "Mr. Caleb, are you staying for breakfast tomorrow?" Caleb looked at Lena, who nodded slightly. "Yes, Emma. I'll be here for breakfast." "Good. I like it when you're here." After Emma shuffled back to bed, Lena turned to Caleb with an expression he couldn't quite read. "She sees you as family now. You know that, right?" "I know. And if this doesn't work, if we fail spectacularly and lose everything, you'll still be part of her life, part of our lives. You understand what you're signing up for?" Caleb thought about all the relationships he'd destroyed through distance and calculation, all the ways he'd protected himself from connection by treating it as transactional. He thought about his daughter Emily, who'd had to teach him how to be human again, and about the black credit card that had started everything because he'd finally been willing to trust without guarantee. "I understand," he said quietly. "And I'm signing up for it anyway." Lena nodded slowly. "Okay then. Partners." Partners. They shook hands formally, sealing a deal that was about so much more than housing or capital or even social change. They were committing to seeing each other clearly, with all the complications and imperfections that implied, and building something together anyway. Outside the window, Boston hummed with its 10 o'clock rhythms, a city full of people trying to make it through one more night. Somewhere in those streets were the families who'd applied for housing, hoping that this time the system might work differently. And in this small apartment in Jamaica Plain, two people from radically different worlds had decided to make sure it did. The foundation of everything they'd build in the coming years was laid in that moment, not in the money committed or the units planned, but in the mutual recognition that character could exist anywhere, that privilege created responsibility, and that the distance between success and struggle was far smaller than anyone wanted to admit. Caleb drove back to his penthouse that night through empty streets, his mind already racing with next steps and new possibilities. But underneath the planning was something quieter and more profound. Gratitude. For a frozen morning in a subway station. For a woman brave enough to stay honest. For a child's drawing that showed him what actually mattered. He'd lost an empire and found a purpose. And somehow, impossibly, that felt like the best trade he'd ever made. The scale of the challenge became brutally clear 3 weeks into construction on their second building. Caleb stood in what should have been a gutted apartment in Dorchester, staring at black mold that crawled up the walls like a living thing, at plumbing so corroded it crumbled when touched, at electrical systems that belonged in a museum of fire hazards. The contractor's estimate had just doubled, and their carefully calculated timeline had evaporated. "We can't open this building in 6 months," Marcus said, his voice tight. "We can't open it in a year, not safely. So we renovate properly." Caleb ran his hand over a wall that felt spongy with water damage. "However long it takes." "That's another $2 million. Minimum. Money we don't have allocated. Then we find it." Lena appeared in the doorway, Emma's hand clasped in hers. The child was on spring break, and Lena had been bringing her to site visits, teaching her daughter what it meant to build something that mattered. Emma's eyes went wide at the destruction. "Mama, is this place sick?" "Yes, baby. Very sick. But we're going to make it better." "Like when I had pneumonia and you took me to the hospital?" Lena knelt down to Emma's level. "Exactly like that. Sometimes helping things get better costs more and takes longer than you planned, but you do it anyway because that's what you do for things you care about." Emma considered this seriously. "Will families live here when it's better?" "That's the plan." "Then it's worth it." She said it with the absolute conviction of childhood, as if the mathematics of compassion were really that simple. Caleb watched this exchange and felt something shift in his chest. They'd been operating on the assumption that they could apply traditional development timelines to their mission. But Lena was right. This wasn't development. It was healing. And healing took as long as it took. "We'll need to go back to the donors," he said to Marcus. "Explain the situation, ask for additional capital. Some of them will see it as mission creep or poor planning. Then they weren't the right partners to begin with." That evening, Caleb drafted another letter. This one was harder to write than the first because it meant admitting that their initial projections had been naive. They'd underestimated the deterioration of affordable housing stock, the true cost of making spaces safe and dignified, the reality that neglected buildings required more than cosmetic fixes. "I sound incompetent," Caleb said, showing Lena the draft over dinner at her kitchen table. She read it carefully, then looked up. "You sound honest. That's better. Honesty doesn't impress investors. The ones worth having, it does." Lena handed back his laptop. "You're not asking them to fund a fantasy. You're asking them to fund reality. If they can't handle that, they should stick to traditional philanthropy where they never have to see the actual problems." The letter went out the next morning. The responses began arriving within hours, and they weren't what Caleb had braced himself for. Jennifer Shaw called first. "I'm in for another $2 million, she said without preamble. "And I want to tour the Dorchester site. I need to see what we're actually dealing with." "It's rough, Jennifer. Really rough." "Good. I'm tired of funding things that look pretty in PowerPoints but never address root causes. Send me the site details." 2 other donors followed with similar commitments, and by the end of the week they'd secured an additional $5 million in capital. Not enough to solve everything, but enough to renovate the Dorchester building properly and maintain momentum. But the financial challenges were only one piece of a larger puzzle. The real resistance came from the city itself. Caleb sat in a city planning office on a Tuesday afternoon, facing an official named Robert Pearson, who'd made a career of understanding zoning codes and using them as weapons. The man's desk was immaculate, except for a single folder labeled Cornerstone Initiative, and his expression suggested he'd already decided the outcome of this meeting. Mr. Monroe, Pearson began, his tone suggesting the title was being used ironically. You want to convert commercial zoned properties into residential affordable housing. You want expedited permits. You want variances on occupancy limits. You want, essentially, to bypass the systems that protect this city's development standards. I want to house people who need housing using buildings that are currently sitting empty, Caleb corrected. And yes, I'm asking for the city to prioritize that mission over bureaucratic inertia. Bureaucratic inertia. Pearson smiled thinly. You mean the carefully constructed policies that prevent exactly the kind of rapid, unvetted development that destabilizes neighborhoods? I mean, the policies that have resulted in families sleeping in cars while perfectly good buildings sit vacant because the paperwork is too complicated. Those buildings are vacant because their owners chose profit over maintenance. You think we should reward that? I think we should prioritize people over property values. Pearson leaned back in his chair. Mr. Monroe, I've been doing this job for 17 years. I've seen 100 wealthy individuals show up with big ideas about fixing poverty. They get some press, feel good about themselves, then disappear when the work gets hard. Why should you be different? It was a fair question. Caleb looked at this man who'd spent nearly 2 decades navigating the intersection of policy and need, who'd probably seen more failure than success, who'd learned to protect the vulnerable by assuming the worst about the powerful. Because I'm not here to feel good about myself, Caleb said quietly. I'm here because someone I barely knew trusted me with unlimited access to my resources, and instead of exploiting that trust, she showed me what character actually looks like. And now I can't unsee it. I can't go back to measuring success by returns that don't account for the people generating them. So either I do this, really do this, for as long as it takes, or I spend the rest of my life knowing I saw clearly and chose to look away. Pearson studied him for a long moment. You're working with Lena Parker. Yes, she's my partner in this. I know Lena. She came through my office 2 years ago when she was fighting an eviction. She had all her paperwork perfect, knew the tenant protection laws better than most attorneys, argued her case like she'd been born in a courtroom. Pearson's expression softened almost imperceptibly. She still lost. Because the system wasn't built to protect people like her, no matter how prepared they were. I've thought about that case a lot since then. Then help us change the system. I can't change the system, Mr. Monroe, but I can work within it more efficiently for people who are actually trying to help. Pearson pulled out a different folder. I'm going to approve your permits for the Dorchester building, but I'm also going to hold you to every safety standard, every inspection, every requirement. No shortcuts, no special treatment. If you're serious about this, you'll welcome that scrutiny. I do. And when the neighborhood association shows up, and they will, I expect you to listen to their concerns. Not perform listening, but actually incorporate community voice into your planning. Agreed. Pearson slid the papers across his desk. Then let's see if you're different from the others. The neighborhood association meeting happened 3 weeks later in a community center in Dorchester. Caleb arrived with Lena and Marcus to find the room packed with residents who ranged from cautiously curious to openly hostile. A woman named Denise Williams, who identified herself as the association president, called the meeting to order with the efficient authority of someone used to fighting institutional indifference. We've all seen the construction at the building on Talbot Avenue, Denise began, and we've all heard promises before about development that's supposed to help the neighborhood. Usually those promises come from people who don't live here, don't look like us, and leave once the property values rise and push us out. So before we talk about your plans, Mr. Monroe, we want to know, who are you really doing this for? The question hung in the air, and Caleb felt every eye in the room measuring his response. He could give them the practiced pitch, the data about housing scarcity and stability metrics. Or he could tell them the truth. 6 months ago, I would have been doing this for myself, he said, to feel better about the fortune I'd built by extracting value from communities like this one. But my partner Lena is going to tell you a different story, and then you can decide for yourselves who we're really here to serve. Lena stood, and Caleb saw her take a breath before speaking. This was harder than the investor pitch, more personal, because these were people who'd lived what she'd lived and would immediately recognize any false notes. I was homeless with my daughter for 2 years, Lena began. I worked every job I could get, but nothing paid enough for first month, last month, and security deposit. Even when I saved enough, landlords wouldn't rent to someone with an eviction on their record, even though that eviction happened because I chose to pay for my daughter's medicine instead of rent. The system punished me for being a good mother, and I was angry about that. I'm still angry about that. She paused, and the room was absolutely silent. Caleb gave me a chance no one else did. He trusted me with his credit card, and I used it to take care of my kid and donate to a shelter. He gave me housing when I needed it most, and now we're trying to build a system where other people don't have to get lucky like I did, where stability is a right, not a privilege. But we can't do that without you. We don't live here. We don't know what this neighborhood needs better than you do, so we're not here to tell you our plans. We're here to ask you what yours are and how we can support them. The shift in the room was palpable. Denise exchanged glances with several other residents, then nodded slowly. Okay, then here's what we need. We need housing that doesn't push out the people who already live here. We need jobs for community members in the construction and management. We need commitments that rents won't skyrocket once the building is full. And we need you to understand that this is our home, not your project. Everything you just said, yes, Caleb replied. We'll write it into our operating agreements. Community hiring requirements, rent caps tied to income ratios, resident advisory boards with actual decision-making power. You tell us what accountability looks like, and we'll build it into the structure. The meeting lasted 3 hours. It was contentious at times, emotional at others, and far more productive than any boardroom negotiation Caleb had participated in during his career. By the end, they had a framework, not perfect but honest, for how the Cornerstone Initiative would operate in Dorchester. More importantly, they had something resembling trust. As people filtered out, Denise approached Caleb and Lena directly. I'm going to watch you, she said. Every step, every decision. And if you start acting like the developers who came before you, I'll make sure everyone knows. Good, Lena said. That's exactly what we need. Denise smiled for the first time that evening. Then maybe you're actually serious about this. The renovation of the Dorchester building took 11 months instead of 6, cost $3 million more than projected, and required complete reconstruction of systems Caleb hadn't even known buildings had. But when it finally opened, it wasn't just housing, it was a statement. The grand opening was held on a Saturday in October, with perfect fall weather and the entire community invited. The building's 15 units were already occupied, families who'd been selected through a lottery system designed by residents to ensure fairness. The ground floor housed a community space that would offer job training, after-school programs, and a food pantry. Caleb stood at the entrance watching families tour the building, children running through hallways that smelled like fresh paint instead of mold, parents asking questions about leases and utilities with an eagerness that came from finally having options. Jennifer Shaw stood beside him, having flown in from San Francisco specifically for this event. This is what success looks like, she said quietly. Not your stock price or your quarterly returns. This. We've housed 30 families, Caleb replied. That's 30 out of thousands who need help. It's not enough. It's 30 families who aren't sleeping in shelters tonight. That's not nothing. Jennifer turned to face him. I've been thinking about the model. What if we scaled it nationally? I know funders in 6 other cities who'd be interested in replicating this. We could create a network, shared resources, shared learning, shared impact measurement. That would require significant capital. I'm aware. I'm also aware that we're currently spending billions on systems that don't work instead of millions on systems that do. The math isn't the problem, Caleb. The imagination is. Before Caleb could respond, Emma appeared, tugging on his sleeve. She was 9 now, taller and more confident, but still carrying that same solemn awareness that came from seeing too much, too young. Mr. Caleb, Mama says you should come meet the family in 3B. They have a daughter my age, and Mama thinks we should be friends. He let Emma lead him through the building, past walls painted in warm colors chosen by a resident committee, past bulletin boards already covered with community announcements and children's artwork, past all the small details that transform square footage into home. The family in 3B was unpacking boxes, the mother directing placement of furniture, while two children explored their new rooms with wide-eyed wonder. "Mr. Monroe," the mother said, extending her hand. "I'm Patricia Johnson. I just wanted to say thank you. My kids have their own bedrooms for the first time in 3 years. That's—" Her voice caught. "That's everything." Caleb shook her hand and tried to find words adequate to the moment. There weren't any. How did you respond to someone thanking you for providing basic dignity that should never have been withheld in the first place? "You're very welcome," he said simply. "I hope this is the beginning of better things for your family." That evening, after the crowds had dispersed and the building had settled into its first night as home instead of construction site, Caleb and Lena sat on the front steps watching the street. Marcus had left an hour earlier, already planning the next phase. Jennifer had departed for the airport with promises to connect them with her network. The day's success hung in the air like a promise that maybe, possibly, they were building something that could last. "I got a job offer," Lena said suddenly. Caleb turned to look at her. "What?" "The city. Robert Pearson recommended me for a position in the Housing Authority. They want someone with lived experience to help redesign their support programs. It's a real job, Caleb. Government benefits, pension, the whole thing. That's wonderful. When do you start?" "I haven't accepted yet." "Why not?" Lena was quiet for a moment, watching a group of kids play basketball under a streetlight. "Because I'm not sure where I'm needed more. Helping the city fix broken systems or helping you build new ones. Those aren't mutually exclusive. You could do both." "Could I?" "This," she gestured at the building behind them. "This is more than full-time. And if we're really going to scale nationally like Jennifer suggested, it's going to require everything we have. I can't split my focus and do either job well." Caleb understood what she wasn't saying. 3 years ago, she'd had nothing and no choices. Now she had opportunities pulling her in different directions, each one meaningful, each one requiring commitment. It was the kind of problem that came from success, but it was still a problem. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to help as many people as possible. I want Emma to see her mother building something that matters. I want to wake up every morning knowing the work I'm doing makes a real difference." Lena looked at him directly. "But I also want stability, security." The government job offers that in ways the foundation doesn't. No matter how well funded we are, we're still dependent on donor goodwill and economic conditions. What happens if another recession hits? What happens if our major funders lose interest? Then we figure it out. We always have. That's easy for you to say. You've never had to worry about where your next meal comes from or whether you can keep a roof over your daughter's head. I have. And now that I finally don't have to worry about those things, you're asking me to risk that security on a vision that might not survive its first major challenge. The honesty of it stung, but Caleb couldn't argue with her logic. He was asking her to take risks that he could absorb, but she couldn't. He was asking her to bet everything on a mission that, despite their success so far, remained unproven at scale. "You should take the city job," he said quietly. "What?" "I mean it. The foundation will survive without you as a full-time partner. And you're right, the city position offers stability you've earned and deserve. Take it. Help fix the systems from inside. We'll collaborate where it makes sense, but you build your security first." Lena shook her head slowly. "That's not what I expected you to say." "What did you expect?" "I expected you to tell me why the foundation was more important, why the mission required sacrifice, why I should choose purpose over security." She smiled slightly. "Instead, you're releasing me from an obligation I never formally made. Because I learned something from you 3 years ago. Character means making choices that honor who you want to be, even when those choices cost you something. You taught me that with a credit card and a donation to a shelter. Now I'm teaching it back to you. Choose what's right for Emma and for you. The foundation will adapt." They sat in silence as the evening deepened around them. Two people who'd come together through chance and built something neither could have imagined. The building behind them glowed with lights from 15 units, each one a small victory against a system designed to keep people like Lena struggling. But victories required more than good intentions. They required sustainability, both for the mission and for the people driving it. "I'll think about it," Lena finally said. The city wants an answer by Monday. Whatever you decide, we're still partners. That doesn't change. Caleb, if I take the city job, we're still partners, he repeated firmly. You don't have to sacrifice your security to prove your commitment. I know who you are. More importantly, you know who you are. That's enough. Lena nodded slowly, and Caleb saw her processing not just his words, but the underlying truth they represented. He'd changed from the man who saw every relationship as transactional, who measured value by what could be extracted. He'd learned finally how to let people choose their own paths without it diminishing his respect for them. The following Monday, Lena accepted the city position. She would start in 2 weeks, working on policy redesign and program evaluation. The Cornerstone Initiative would hire a new director of operations, someone with housing development experience who could handle the day-to-day, while Caleb focused on fundraising and expansion strategy. Lena would remain on the board, contributing her insight without bearing the full operational burden. It wasn't the partnership Caleb had originally imagined, but it was better, more sustainable, more respectful of the reality that people needed security before they could fully commit to changing systems that had failed them. The Foundation's first annual report went out in November, documenting their progress with brutal honesty. 30 families housed in Boston, 2 buildings renovated, $7 million spent, 15 community partners engaged, but also timelines missed, budgets exceeded, challenges underestimated, learning curves steeper than projected. You're making us look incompetent, Marcus warned when he reviewed the draft. I'm making us look honest, Caleb replied. People don't need another glossy report full of cherry-picked metrics. They need to see what it actually takes to build something that matters. The report included photos of families in their new homes, alongside photos of the mold and decay they'd had to remediate. It showed the true cost of affordable housing done right, the community resistance they'd faced and worked through, the policy barriers that still needed to be overcome. It ended with a simple question. Now that you know what it really takes, are you still willing to fund it? The responses surprised them. Several donors increased their commitments specifically because of the honesty. 3 new foundations reached out wanting to learn from their mistakes. And most significantly, 2 city governments, Philadelphia and Detroit, contacted them about replicating the model in their communities. By December, exactly 1 year after Caleb had handed his credit card to a homeless woman in a Boston subway station, the Cornerstone Initiative had expanded to 3 cities, housed 87 families, and established a template for housing development that prioritized dignity over profit. It wasn't revolutionary in scope, not yet, but it was real, solid, built to last. Caleb spent Christmas Eve at Lena's apartment, which had become his second home over the past year. Emily was there too, having flown in from New York, where she'd recently started her own nonprofit focused on educational equity. The 4 of them, Caleb, Emily, Lena, and Emma, sat around the small kitchen table sharing a meal that Lena had insisted on cooking herself. Remember last Christmas? Emily asked. When I wouldn't even take your calls? I remember. I was so angry at you, angry that you'd built this enormous successful life but couldn't see anything beyond your own reflection in it. Emily reached across the table and squeezed his hand. I'm not angry anymore, Dad. I'm proud. Emma, now 9 and increasingly aware of the conversations happening around her, looked between the adults with serious eyes. Mr. Caleb, did you really give Mama your credit card when we were homeless? I did. Why? It was the question everyone had asked, the question Caleb had spent a year trying to answer completely. Now, looking at this child who'd drawn him into her picture of happiness, he finally had words that felt true. Because I needed to know if I'd been right about people. And your mama proved I'd been wrong. She proved that character doesn't depend on circumstances. It defines how you respond to them. And once I saw that clearly, I couldn't unsee it. So I had to change everything about how I measured success. Emma considered this with the gravity children bring to adult concepts they're trying to understand. Did it work? Changing everything? Caleb looked around the table, at his daughter who'd forgiven him, at Lena who'd trusted him, at Emma who'd included him, and felt the warm certainty of knowing exactly where he belonged. Yes, he said simply. It worked. Outside, Boston settled into its holiday rhythms. In 3 buildings across the city, 87 families celebrated Christmas in homes they could afford, in spaces that honored their dignity. in a system that had finally chosen to see them as people instead of problems. It wasn't enough yet. Thousands still needed help. But it was real, and it was growing, and it proved that change was possible when enough people decided to measure success by impact instead of returns. Caleb Monroe had lost an empire and found a purpose. And on this particular Christmas Eve, surrounded by people who taught him what actually mattered, he couldn't imagine a better trade. The crisis came in February during one of those bitter Boston winters that made even optimists question their life choices. Caleb was reviewing expansion proposals for Cleveland when Marcus burst into his office with an expression that triggered every disaster instinct Caleb had developed over decades in business. "We have a problem," Marcus said, closing the door behind him. "A big one." Caleb set down his papers. "How big?" "Jennifer Shaw just pulled her funding, all of it, $10 million that we've already committed to the Philadelphia and Detroit projects." The words landed like physical blows. Jennifer had been their anchor donor, the one whose early commitment had convinced others to follow. Without her support, the entire expansion strategy collapsed. "Why? What happened?" Marcus handed him a tablet showing a news article. The headline read, "Tech Billionaire Jennifer Shaw under federal investigation for securities fraud." The story detailed allegations of insider trading, market manipulation, and accounting irregularities at her company. Whether the charges were legitimate or not hardly mattered. Jennifer's assets were frozen pending investigation, and every organization associated with her was scrambling to create distance. "She called me an hour ago," Marcus continued. "She's devastated. She believes in what we're doing, but legally she can't maintain any philanthropic commitments until this is resolved, and that could take years." Caleb felt the familiar cold calculation of crisis management taking over. $10 million represented more than just funding. It was credibility, momentum, proof of concept. Without it, they'd have to cancel the Philadelphia launch, scale back Detroit, and probably lay off half their staff. "Who else knows?" he asked. "Just us so far, but the other donors will find out within days, and when they do, some of them will panic and pull out too." "How much runway do we have?" 3 months if we immediately halt all expansion, 6 weeks if we try to maintain current operations. 3 months. 6 weeks. The difference between an orderly shutdown and catastrophic collapse. Caleb stared at the numbers on the tablet and felt the weight of every family counting on them. Every employee who'd taken a chance on this mission. Every community partner who'd believed their promises. His phone buzzed. Lena, calling from her office at the City Housing Authority. "I just saw the news about Jennifer," she said without preamble. "How bad is it?" "Bad. We're looking at potential shutdown." Lena was quiet for a moment. "What do you need?" "Time, and a miracle. Time I can't give you, but maybe I can help with the other thing. Can you meet me at City Hall in an hour?" Caleb arrived at City Hall to find Lena waiting with Robert Pearson, the planning official who'd initially approved their permits. Both wore expressions that suggested they'd been strategizing, and Caleb felt a flicker of hope despite the circumstances. "Robert has an idea," Lena said as they settled into a conference room. "Tell him." Pearson pulled out a thick folder. "The city is sitting on $43 million in federal housing grants that we can't deploy because we don't have partner organizations capable of executing at scale. Most local nonprofits are too small, and traditional developers won't work within the affordability requirements. But Cornerstone has proven it can deliver quality, affordable housing with community input and financial transparency." "You want us to apply for city contracts?" Caleb asked. "I want to offer you a partnership. The city provides the capital, you provide the execution. It's not philanthropy, it's procurement. You'd have to meet strict timelines, compliance requirements, and outcome metrics. But it would give you sustainable funding that doesn't depend on individual donors." Caleb looked at Lena, who nodded slightly. "It changes everything about how we operate," she said. "Government contracts mean government oversight, slower approvals, less flexibility. But it also means stability. And right now, stability might be worth the trade-offs." "What's the catch?" Caleb asked Pearson. "The catch is that the city council has to approve any partnership, and there are members who remember you as the private equity CEO who extracted value from this city for 2 decades. They'll need convincing that you're actually committed to this mission and not just rehabilitating your reputation." "When's the vote?" 2 weeks.
which means you have 2 weeks to prove that Cornerstone is worth betting $43 million of public money on. The campaign to win city council approval consumed every waking hour. Caleb and Marcus prepared presentations showing their track record, their financial management, their community partnerships. Lena leveraged her relationships within city government to arrange meetings with skeptical council members. They brought in residents from their buildings to testify about the impact, compiled data on outcomes, and demonstrated that their model actually worked. But the strongest opposition came from an unexpected source. Richard Thompson, Caleb's former board chairman, had been quietly organizing business leaders to oppose the partnership. He appeared at a council hearing 3 days before the vote, impeccably dressed and armed with his own presentation. "I'm here to warn you against partnering with Caleb Monroe," Thompson began, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being heard. "Mr. Monroe is not a housing expert. He's a failed CEO with a savior complex who's playing at social change with other people's money. His foundation has missed every timeline, exceeded every budget, and demonstrated no sustainable path to profitability." "That's because we're not trying to be profitable," Caleb interjected from the audience. "We're trying to house people." "Exactly my point," Thompson continued smoothly. "Mr. Monroe has abandoned every principle of sound business management in favor of feel-good metrics that don't translate to scalable impact. The city would be foolish to trust $43 million to someone who's demonstrated such poor judgment." The hearing dissolved into argument. Council members demanded answers about financial sustainability and long-term viability. Residents defended Cornerstone's work while business leaders questioned whether government should be funding what they saw as charity rather than development. By the time it ended, the vote looked uncertain at best. Caleb walked out of City Hall feeling defeated. Thompson was right about the timelines and budgets, even if he was wrong about the reasons. They had delivered results, but not efficiently by traditional measures. And now that inefficiency might cost them everything. His phone rang. Emily. "I saw the hearing on the city's live stream," she said. "Thompson's still trying to destroy you." "He's trying to destroy what I'm building now because of who I was then. I can't really blame him. I gave him plenty of reasons to doubt me." "But you've changed, Dad. Anyone who's actually paying attention can see that. Maybe change isn't enough. Maybe I should have started this work as someone without my history." Emily was quiet for a moment. "Or maybe your history is exactly why your work matters. You're not some naive idealist who thinks poverty can be solved with good intentions. You're someone who built an empire on extraction and then chose to dismantle it piece by piece to build something better. That's a story worth telling." After they hung up, Caleb sat in his car and thought about what Emily had said. He'd been so focused on proving he'd changed that he'd forgotten to explain why the change mattered. He'd shown results without showing the journey that made those results meaningful. He called Marcus. "Can you get me on the agenda for the next council hearing? That's tomorrow, last chance before the vote." "I know, get me on the agenda. I have something to say." The council chamber was packed for the final hearing. Thompson was there with his coalition of business leaders. Residents from Cornerstone buildings filled several rows. Lena sat in the front, Emma beside her, both watching Caleb with expressions that mixed hope and concern. When Caleb's turn came to speak, he walked to the microphone without notes or presentations, just him and the truth. "My name is Caleb Monroe, and 15 months ago I was the CEO of a private equity firm that made hundreds of millions extracting value from communities like yours. I was very good at it. I knew exactly how to identify underpriced assets, maximize returns, and move on before anyone could calculate the human cost of my efficiency." The chamber was absolutely silent. "Then I met a woman in a subway station who had nothing, and I gave her unlimited access to my resources to see what she'd do with them. I expected her to prove that poverty made people desperate and selfish. Instead, she proved that I was the desperate one, desperate to believe my success was justified, that the system I'd mastered was fundamentally sound, that people at the bottom deserved to be there." Caleb looked directly at Thompson. "My former colleague is right that I've missed timelines and exceeded budgets. He's right that I've abandoned traditional business principles. What he's wrong about is whether that represents failure, because the metrics we should be measuring are these: 87 families stably housed for over a year,
with 93% employment retention and 100% school attendance for the children. 0 evictions, 0 displacement, 0 families choosing between food and rent. He turned back to the council. You're not betting $43 million on me. You're betting it on a model that works because it was designed by people who've actually experienced housing instability, on a team that includes formerly homeless individuals now serving as program directors, on a system that prioritizes community input over investor returns. Yes, it costs more and takes longer than traditional development. That's because we're building homes, not units. Stability, not occupancy. Futures, not quarterly reports. Caleb paused, feeling the weight of what came next. But I understand if my past makes you unwilling to trust my present. If that's the case, I'll step back. I'll hand Cornerstone over to someone without my history and support them however I can. Because this mission is bigger than my redemption story. These families deserve better than to be collateral damage in my attempt to prove I've changed. He returned to his seat, and the room erupted in overlapping voices. Council members called for order while residents applauded or shouted questions. Thompson sat stone-faced, clearly calculating whether Caleb's offer to step down was genuine or strategic. The council debate lasted 3 hours. Members argued about risk and reward, about whether government should fund innovation or stick to proven models, about whether people deserved second chances, and whether those chances should come with $43 million attached. The vote came down to a single council member, a woman named Angela Rivera, who'd remained silent throughout the hearings. When her turn came, she looked directly at Caleb. I was homeless once, she said quietly, 15 years ago, before I got into politics. I know what it's like to have nothing and be told it's your own fault. I also know what it's like when someone finally sees you as a person instead of a problem. So I'm voting yes, not because I trust you, Mr. Monroe, but because I trust the people you're working with, and because I believe systems can change when the people running them actually want them to. The measure passed 6-5. The partnership with the city transformed Cornerstone overnight. Suddenly they had capital, stability, and the credibility that came with government backing. But they also had scrutiny, compliance requirements, and bureaucratic oversight that tested every aspect of their operations. The first city-funded project broke ground in April, a 40-unit building in Roxbury that would house families transitioning from shelters. Every decision required documentation, every dollar spent demanded justification, every timeline missed triggered reviews. It was exhausting and frustrating and exactly what Cornerstone needed to prove they could deliver at scale. Lena, working from her position at the Housing Authority, helped navigate the bureaucratic maze while maintaining the community-centered approach that made their work effective. Marcus built financial systems robust enough to satisfy auditors while keeping costs aligned with mission. And Caleb learned, slowly and painfully, how to lead without controlling, how to trust process over personality, how to build something sustainable instead of just successful. The Roxbury building opened in November, exactly on schedule and within budget. 40 families moved in over the course of 3 days, and Caleb stood back and watched other people handle the celebrations. His role had changed from visionary founder to operational support, and he discovered that the view from the background was actually clearer than the one from the front. Emma, now 10 and impossibly articulate, gave a speech at the opening about what housing meant to families like hers. She talked about having her own room, about being able to invite friends over without shame, about watching her mother go from survival mode to thriving mode once stability removed the daily crisis of finding shelter. Mr. Caleb gave my mama a credit card 3 years ago, Emma said to the crowd. But what he really gave us was the chance to be seen. And once someone finally sees you, you can start seeing yourself differently. That's what this building is. It's people seeing other people and deciding they matter. Caleb found himself crying, something he hadn't done in public since his father's funeral 25 years ago. These weren't tears of sadness or even joy. They were tears of recognition. Recognition that the little girl who'd drawn him into her picture of happiness had somehow understood the entire mission better than any strategic plan ever could. That evening, Caleb gathered with the core team, Marcus, Lena, Denise Williams from the Dorchester Neighborhood Association, and Robert Pearson from the city to review their 3-year impact report. The numbers told a story that still felt impossible. 217 families housed across 4 cities with more than 4,000 people on waiting lists. 15 buildings renovated with community input, 32 community partners engaged, $18 million deployed with 97% efficiency. But the numbers Caleb kept returning to were different. 3 formerly homeless individuals now employed as Cornerstone program directors. 15 families who'd been able to buy homes after building credit and savings through stable housing. 8 children who'd improved their grades by 2 letter grades or more once housing instability was removed. "We're still not big enough," Lena said, echoing the concern that haunted all of them. "For every family we house, 5 more apply. We're making progress, but we're not making enough." "Maybe that's not our job," Caleb said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. "What if our job isn't to house everyone ourselves? What if it's to prove the model works so well that others have no choice but to replicate it? We've shown that dignity-centered housing development is financially sustainable, socially transformative, and politically viable. Now we need to teach others how to do it." Marcus nodded slowly. "You're talking about becoming a training organization, teaching other cities, other nonprofits, other developers how to build what we've built." "Exactly. We keep operating our buildings, but we also start sharing our failures and successes openly. We create a playbook that any organization can follow. We become the proof of concept that changes how everyone thinks about affordable housing." The idea took root quickly. By December, they'd secured foundation funding to develop training materials and technical assistance programs. By March, they'd hosted their first cohort, 15 organizations from across the country learning the Cornerstone model. By summer, 3 of those organizations had launched their own housing initiatives using the framework. The multiplication felt different than Caleb's old business expansion strategies. Slower, more organic, but somehow more permanent. They weren't creating franchises or satellites. They were planting seeds that would grow in their own soil, adapted to their own contexts, responsive to their own communities. On the 4th anniversary of the credit card test, Caleb found himself back at the Charles Street subway station. Not by accident. He'd come deliberately, wanting to stand in the space where everything had changed. It was early morning, the same bitter February cold, the same commuter crowds pouring through the station entrance. He almost didn't see her at first. A woman sitting against the wall, a child curled against her, both wrapped in insufficient layers. The mirror image of Lena 4 years ago, proof that Cornerstone's success hadn't solved the systemic problem, had only addressed its symptoms for a few hundred families. Caleb stood there for a long moment, watching this stranger who represented every person still waiting, still struggling, still hoping someone would finally see them clearly. He reached for his wallet, then stopped. A credit card wouldn't solve her problem. It might help for a day, but tomorrow the crisis would return. Instead, he pulled out a business card and approached carefully. "Excuse me," he said gently. "My name is Caleb Monroe. I run a housing organization called Cornerstone Initiative. We have emergency shelter partnerships and permanent housing programs. If you're interested, I can make a call right now and get you connected with someone who can help." The woman looked up at him with the same mixture of fear and hope he'd seen in Lena's eyes 4 years ago. "Is this real?" she asked. "Or are you one of those people who makes promises they don't keep?" "It's real. And I won't make you promises about what happens after today. But I can promise that someone will listen, someone will try, and someone will treat you like you deserve dignity and options." The woman took the card with shaking hands. "Why? Why do you care?" "Because someone like you taught me to see clearly, and once you see clearly, you can't look away." He made the call to Cornerstone's emergency housing coordinator, who arranged for immediate shelter placement. He waited with the woman and her daughter until the transport arrived, making small talk about nothing important, just being present so they didn't have to face this transition alone. As the van pulled away, Caleb's phone buzzed with a text from Lena. "Emma wants to know if you're coming to her school presentation tonight. She's talking about affordable housing policy. Apparently, you're partly responsible for her becoming an activist at age 10. He smiled and typed back, "Wouldn't miss it." That evening, Caleb sat in an elementary school auditorium listening to Emma Parker explain to her classmates why everyone deserves safe housing. She used charts she'd made herself showing the relationship between stability and success. She told her own story without shame or self-pity. And she ended with a challenge. "Every person in this room has the power to see people who are invisible," Emma said to the audience. You just have to decide to look. And once you really see someone, you can't unsee them. So the question is, are you brave enough to look? The auditorium erupted in applause. Caleb found himself standing, clapping until his hands hurt, watching this child who'd been sleeping in a subway station 4 years ago, now teaching others about social justice and human dignity. After the presentation, Emma ran to him with the unselfconscious affection of a child who'd decided he was family. "Did I do okay?" she asked. "You did more than okay. You were brilliant. Mama says I have a big future ahead of me. She says I can be anything I want." "Your mama's right. What do you want to be?" Emma considered the question seriously. "I want to be someone who helps people like you and Mama help people. I want to be someone who sees clearly." Caleb knelt down to her level. "You already are, Emma. You've been seeing clearly since the day I met you." That night, Caleb drove through Boston feeling the weight and lightness of everything they'd built. 4 years ago, he'd been a billionaire CEO with an empire built on extraction and a life emptied of meaning. Now he was something different. Not poorer, but not richer either, existing in some space between success and significance that he was still learning to navigate. His phone rang. Marcus, calling from his car. "The Philadelphia expansion just hit full occupancy," Marcus said. 100 families housed, and Detroit is projecting to open their 3rd building next month. "That's good news. Caleb, we're actually doing this. We're actually changing systems. It's slow and messy and nothing like we planned, but it's working." "Yeah," Caleb said softly. "It is." After they hung up, Caleb pulled over at a viewpoint overlooking the harbor. The city spread out below him, millions of people living millions of lives, most of them struggling in ways he'd spent 43 years deliberately not seeing. Cornerstone had housed hundreds and influenced thousands, but millions still needed help. It would take more than one foundation, more than one model, more than one lifetime to solve. But that wasn't an excuse for inaction. It was an invitation to begin. And Caleb had learned, finally, that beginning was enough. He pulled out his phone and looked at the photo he still kept as his wallpaper. Emma's drawing from 4 years ago, 2 stick figures under a happy sun, the image that had shown him what actually mattered. His phone buzzed with a new message. "Lena, thanks for coming tonight. Emma couldn't stop talking about you after. She wants to know if you'll teach her about impact investing this weekend, because apparently 10-year-olds should understand capital allocation. I told her you'd probably say yes because you're a terrible influence who encourages children to think about systemic change." Caleb smiled and typed back, "Absolutely yes. Tell her to bring questions and I'll bring examples of how I failed for 20 years before I got anything right. She should know that clarity isn't something you find. It's something you earn." He sat there for a long time, watching the city lights reflect off the harbor, thinking about the woman he'd met that morning and the thousands like her still waiting for someone to see them clearly. Thinking about Lena, who trusted him when she had no reason to. About Marcus, who'd followed him into uncertainty. About Emily, who'd forgiven him. About Emma, who'd included him. The credit card test had been designed to prove what people did when they had nothing to lose. Instead, it had revealed what they became when someone finally gave them something to gain: dignity, stability, options, hope. And Caleb Monroe, once defined by his ability to extract maximum value from minimum investment, had learned that the opposite was actually true. The greatest returns came not from taking, but from giving, not from isolation, but from connection, not from power, but from purpose. He started the car and drove toward home. Not his penthouse anymore, but a modest brownstone in Jamaica Plain that he'd bought 3 blocks from Lena's apartment. A place where he could walk to dinner at her kitchen table, where Emma could knock on his door asking questions about economics and justice, where he could live in the community he was trying to serve instead of observing it from 30 floors up. 4 years ago, he'd handed a credit card to a stranger and called it a test of human nature. Now he understood it had been a test of his own, whether someone who'd succeeded by never trusting could learn to trust completely, whether privilege could recognize its obligations, whether empire could become service. He'd passed the test by learning to fail forward, to value impact over image, to measure success by lives changed instead of dollars accumulated. He'd passed it by becoming someone Emma Parker could look up to, not because of what he owned, but because of what he'd chosen to build with it. The credit card itself lived in a frame in his office now, retired from use but preserved as reminder. On a small plaque below it, he'd engraved Emma's words from that first night. The sun is there because today was a happy day. Not every day was happy. The work remained hard, the problems remained vast, the solutions remained incomplete. But Caleb had learned something that no amount of wealth or power had taught him. That happiness came not from having everything, but from giving what you had to people who needed it more. Not from standing above, but from standing beside. Not from the view from the top, but from the perspective at ground level where actual life happened. He pulled into his driveway and saw Lena's apartment lights glowing 3 blocks away. Tomorrow they'd meet to review applications for their next building. Next week they'd present to City Council about expanding the partnership. Next month they'd host another training cohort teaching others how to replicate their model. But tonight, Caleb Monroe, former billionaire, failed CEO, recovering cynic, and newly minted believer in the power of seeing people clearly, would sleep knowing that somewhere in Boston, 217 families were safe and warm because he'd finally asked the right question 4 years ago in a frozen subway station. Not, what will people do when they have nothing to lose, but rather, who could I become if I finally stopped protecting what I didn't need and started sharing what I did? The answer had cost him an empire and given him everything that mattered. And standing in his driveway in Jamaica Plain, with Emma's drawing on his phone and Lena's text in his messages and Marcus's good news in his ears, Caleb understood that character didn't just multiply meaning. It was the only thing that gave meaning permission to exist at all. He locked his car and walked toward home, ready for tomorrow's work, grateful for today's progress, and finally, impossibly, at peace with the man he'd become by learning to see the people he'd spent a lifetime overlooking. The test was over. The real work had just begun. And for the first time in 47 years, Caleb Monroe knew exactly what success was for.